question I want to talk about today is how might free culture begin to relate to other social movements? This is the question that Heather raised yesterday. And I'll start with several quick examples of what I call digital citizenship. I think you'll quickly connect the dots. First, we'll start with the story of how the bloggers did a much better, more accurate job of talking about covering the run-up to the Iraq War than some of the major mainstream press like the New York Times and the Washington Post. The mainstream media famously gave us a lot of misleading news about weapons of mass destruction, and that was at best, and at worst, outright government propaganda, as we've learned in recent years. Then there was the story of Virginia Governor George Allen, who, while running for the U.S. Senate in 2004, was being filmed by a college student of Indian heritage who was called a macaca by George Allen, which the video of this incident was placed on YouTube and is largely regarded as a factor in his loss and bid for his Senate seat and the Democrats' recontrol of the U.S. Senate. Now, this photo depicts Barack Obama as a mosaic of more than 1.5 million contributors to his campaign. A number that has actually risen to about 2 million, I'm told. And one of the key reasons for Obama's long-shot candidacy was precisely because he engaged the online world through social networking, helped people mobilize themselves, and took in more than $400 million, most of it in amounts of less than $200. And we have the story that some of you may be familiar with about bloggers and activists exposing the flaws in Diebold voting machines. When Diebold tried to suppress some of the evidence of this by invoking copyright law, the students and other activists published documents on the web, which triggered many investigations in a lot of states, and in several states, Diebold voting machines have been banned. Then there's the story of a group of activists, lawyers, journalists, and academics who created a public wiki to document the lethal side effects of an antipsychotic drug called Zyprexa. They also, the manufacturer, Eli Lilly, also had allegedly suppressed the evidence of the risks. Prosecutors have since sought a $1 billion fine against the drug maker for the suppression of that evidence. Now, I apologize for not having more international examples. I'm sure they could be replicated quite easily. One might think of the huge flash mobs that have assembled in Seoul, South Korea, to protest the president's meat import policies. And then the Egyptians who used the internet to help protest the soaring food prices there. Now, what these incidents, you might say, what do these wildly different episodes suggest? To me, they're evidence of a new kind of internet-based citizenship. Thanks to the internet and digital technology, citizens increasingly can play a direct role in politics and self-governance. We're acquiring new abilities to instigate action based on our own priorities, our own vision, our own voices. And I call this history-making citizenship, because citizens don't need to be in the periphery anymore. We don't need to plead with politicians or news media to express what we're feeling. We have the power to do it directly on a global stage and to speak in our own voice. Now, what's significant about history-making citizenship is its challenge to the centralized bureaucracies of government and corporations. We commoners, I think, have some underappreciated advantages in over these dinosaurs who are still trying to figure out how to operate on open platforms. In a great many instances, we have more reliable and more timely knowledge than the big institutions. We have access to larger pools of talent, more eyes, more ears, more creative minds in many more locations than the centralized institutions that are claiming the right to govern us. Now, one of the most powerful vehicles for this transformation is the commons, which I think is a new paradigm of value creation. A commons arises whenever a given community decides that it wants to manage resources in a collective manner with a special regard for the fairness and sustainability and equitable access to that resource. And we're seeing the rise and the expansion of just all sorts of new genres of commons. We have, of course, free software, we have collaborative websites and archives, we've we've got social networking communities, we've got the tens of millions of blogs in the blogosphere, we have a large constellation of wikis, we've got the music remix and video mashup communities which are expanding. And all of these I regard as the commons sector. What unites them is their innovative ways of creating value outside of conventional market structures. The commons sector is all about socially created value. Socially created value is becoming a macroeconomic and cultural force in its own right, as people like Yochai Benkler have written so insightfully about over the years. Now, I call this the great value shift. That's what the rise of the commons is triggering. Socially created value, or the market, is no longer necessarily the only or the best way to create value these days. Increasingly, the commons is a more accessible, a more efficient, and more productive way of creating value in an alternative way to the market. And this is one reason that so many commons are just exploding all over. The commons paradigm can be seen in many different ways. They don't all have the same attributes, but I think they do represent similar commons dynamics. So this leads me to my first point. I think it's time for us to take stock of the larger political ramifications that these many projects of the commons sector constitute. Why? Because I think the commons sector represents an emergent new kind of political culture, one that has the capacity to transform the current order of things, an order that in many ways is structurally hostile to some of our core values. But the new commons sector is not an ideological movement, however, nor is it a conventional form of politics. I think it's not about posturing or messaging or symbolism. It's not about tactical maneuvers or power grabs. It's not about ideology. But the commons sector is really about something more basic and enduring. It's about changing how people do things at the grassroots level in a very practical way, and thereby changing the infrastructure and context by which we carry on politics. Now, this is an indirect and long-term strategy, but it's ultimately, I think, a more effective one than conventional politics. And for me, it brings to mind the ancient Chinese game Go, where the better player encircles the other player who, before he realizes it, has been outmaneuvered, not even realizing there's been a threat. So project by project, working at the grassroots, we at the commons sector are confronting, I think, some of the pathologies of existing markets and corrupt government by building our own working alternatives. We're building new forms of power and new institutions that can fight the closed oligopolies that are serving the few, the connected, and the wealthy. And this is how the commons is serving as a new vehicle for political and cultural transformation. Buckminster Fuller once said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing models obsolete." And I think this has been the Creative Commons strategy from day one. Let's invent a new culture, a free culture, a culture that can protect itself from private market capture and from government control. Invent a culture that can build new types of markets and pioneer new types of self-governance. And that is, in effect, what's come to pass over the past 10 years. The commons sector has become a competing form of governance in many societies. As I put it in the subtitle of my forthcoming book, Viral Spiral, the commoners are building a digital republic of their own. My book's due out in January, and it tells the history of how this digital republic has been built. It tells the history of the struggle to create free software and the Creative Commons licenses, and the growth of what I call viral spirals of things like open educational resources, open business models, open science, open access publishing. There's many others. The commons is a competing form of governance because it establishes a stable alternative power base. It competes, in a sense, with government-made law and with seller-dominated markets, with its own special capacities. A few years ago, the internet scholar David Johnson declared that online commons represent a new kind of social biological metabolism for creating law. It has its own internal systems for managing its affairs and for interacting with its environment. It can repair itself and has its own persistent identity. So what's really important is that the commons, as a new kind of organism in our culture, can increasingly compete with and even outperform conventional institutions of government, business, and media. A new paradigm of self-organizing behavior and governance, the commons sector represents a great leap forward in citizenship. I'm sorry, I meant to show this slide as commons as a new metabolism. It represents a great leap forward in citizenship because, consider, at least in the history of my country, the United States, in the 18th century, citizenship was about affirming the decisions of the landed elite. And in the 19th century, citizenship was mostly about belonging to a political party and directing one's energies there. And in the 20th century, much of citizenship was about being an educated voter and trying to reform government and direct your will through that means. But I think today, the commons sector is taking citizenship to an entirely new level. It's all about honoring access, open access and transparency, and the freedom to participate, and social equity in ways that governments cannot or will not. So this is what I mean when I say that free culture represents a new kind of democratic polity, a new form of governance. The thousands of commons that we're all creating collectively represent a new kind of digital republic, an emerging free culture nation, you might say, without borders. Now, many political elites are distinctly uneasy about the commons. They're not so sure they like all this transparency and open participation, and they're wary about the idea of direct access to knowledge. And decentralized, self-generated action, why, it can't be controlled by a party or a bureaucracy. It's anarchy. It's out of control. And even many of our so-called liberal friends don't really trust decentralized citizenship, perhaps because it threatens their own roles as self-appointed proxies for the masses. So, as you can see, there's many barriers we have to overcome to actualize digital citizenship. Then there's the distressing fact that free culture and open networks don't fit into neat ideological pigeonholes. But this, I think, is really the secret of our power. We don't define ourselves by what we're against, but by our own affirmative vision of the future. We're more intent on inventing something new than in fighting yesterday's ideological battles. And this really is quite a benefit because we're not imprisoned by identity politics or stale ideologies. We're not constrained by the organizational structures of the past because we're all about investing ourselves in a more dynamic, improvised way of building the future. And I think this is the foundation for a new political vision that deserves to go wide. So my argument so far goes like this. We're seeing the rise of a new kind of citizenship that's beginning to show serious power and political sophistication. This power stems from the fact that the commons sector is an economic force in its own right, and it commands greater moral credibility and cultural authenticity than many other institutions. And it represents an insurgent form of democratic power that can't be easily coordinated or consolidated or co-opted. So I consider the creation of the digital republic the achievement of a generation. It arguably started with free software, gained new momentum with the creation and expansion of the Creative Commons licenses, took off with the arrival of Web 2.0, and now is exploding with all the innovations that we see represented here at iCommons today. Now for the rest of my argument. I think that it's time for free culture to take its own political potential more seriously. We commoners need to find new ways to engage with mainstream political culture and lend support to other commoners, especially those commoners who are working outside of the universe of information and culture. And this was a point I think Heather referred to yesterday. Because the truth of the matter is that there are market enclosures out there that are destroying many other commonses. As the editor of onthecommons.org, I see the dynamics of enclosure replicated in dozens of different areas. Market enclosures are consuming the atmosphere, agricultural seeds, the human genome, 2/3 of which is patented. It may soon turn the Arctic into a massive drilling field. It may eliminate much of the biodiversity that life depends on. Our civic spaces, the media, also subject to enclosures. So I think the next natural step in the evolution of the free culture movement is to explore how we might be able to make common cause with these other commoners and challenge other sorts of market enclosures of nature, of public infrastructure, of local communities, enclosures that the North is imposing on the South. We in free culture have learned a great deal over the years about how markets can be closed, anti-competitive, and proprietary, and how this can result in profound assaults against freedom, social equity, and democracy. But we've also learned to devise our own creative solutions, new mechanisms of law, technologies, social norms that can protect the commons. And we found each other, which is not insignificant. So given the enormous challenges facing our planet and the people in developing countries and the nearly universal yearning for more responsive institutions of business and government, it only makes sense that the digital citizens of free culture turn their gaze to the many mainstream political challenges that are facing us today. As most of you know, Larry Lessig is trying to bring some of the tools and insights of the Commons to a new project called Change Congress, which is seeking to tackle the systemic corruption of the democratic process in the U.S. Congress. But Larry points us to an inescapable fact that there's a wider political arena out there that needs our attention. Fortunately, there are also millions of other commoners out there who want to see more humane and effective models of development, who want governments to respect basic human rights and democratic freedoms, and who have more bracing visions of progress than that offered by privatization and crony capitalism. Now, we're going to have the one problem in making this outreach is that there's a significant difference between market enclosures of nature and market enclosures of culture. The difference is that creative works are not depletable. A song or video or book doesn't get used up. They can be reproduced for next to nothing. And so instead of having a tragedy in the commons, you have a comedy in the commons. But in the world of natural resources, the dynamic is precisely the opposite. Natural resources tend to be depletable, and the more we use the sky as a waste dump or use up finite supplies of oil, there's less of those resources. So the fundamental difference in the nature of the shared resource means that this other branch of the commons family has a very different kind of politics. And one branch is trying to unleash abundance, the other is trying to allocate scarcity fairly. And so however, we do share a common thing, that we're both dealing with twin errors of neoliberal economic policy. In one case, scarce resources are treated as infinite, and another, limited resources are treated as, or limitless resources are treated as scarce. So despite our differences with other commoners, we're all fighting market enclosures. We're all fighting expansions of private property rights that make it impossible to provide for the collective good. We're all trying to declare our collective wealth as inalienable and to fight the forced conversions of commons into markets. We're all trying to invent new mechanisms to protect the commons. Given the expertise represented in the room, I think it's time to open up some new conversations with these other commoners who are adjacent to our own work. We in free culture have some important things to offer. First, we offer the narrative of the commons, a narrative that helps us reclaim that which has been taken from us through market enclosure. We also offer sophistication about the internet and digital technologies, a talent that gives us a certain home field advantage as more and more of life goes online. And third, we have a moral credibility and competence that is rooted in the subversive ethic that culture should be open, participatory, and democratic. So for all these reasons, the commons sector, for me, represents a sleeping volcano of potential political power. It's a power to challenge governments and businesses that are closed, stagnant, and unresponsive to new ideas. It's also a power to transform the existing generation of citizen advocacy groups, many of which themselves have become stodgy, compromised, and lacking in vision and grassroots energy. I realize what I'm proposing here is maybe beyond the scope and competence of iCommons and free culture as they now exist. Indeed, some skeptics may oppose outright wading into the grubby thickets of conventional political life. And these are fair concerns. But I'm convinced that free culture has always retained its vitality by looking outward and trying to start new viral spirals with commoners who share our desire to make the world a better place. That's a real source of energy. And we the people of this iCommons network are a very unusual group. We have great transnational reach, we have great political skills, we have great tech expertise, and we pride ourselves on our democratic values and idealism, but are also rooted in a pragmatic commitment to things that work. So imagine if our talents could go beyond the familiar circle of free culture issues and start to reach a world that is really desperate for new ideas, new political tools, and new leadership. And imagine if we could strengthen our own free culture advocacy by developing new partnerships with other commoners who could in turn support our work. It's presumptuous of me, or anyone actually, to say how this next stage of free culture should unfold. Indeed, there's not likely to be a single path, and in any case, it's up to the commoners themselves to decide. But I do think it's time to explore the possibilities and to begin some exciting, and I think very necessary, new conversations in this regard. So, thank you so much.